On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 20, Man's Place in Nature. The desert is monotheist. This is the well-known phrase that Renan added to the rereading of a manuscript, a phrase which has become famous today. It figures in the general history and comparative system of Semitic languages. Nature holds little place in Semitic religions. The desert is monotheist, sublime in its immense uniformity. It first revealed the idea of infinity to man, but not the feeling of an incessantly creative life that a more fertile nature inspired in other races. This turn of phrase is no longer so common today, independently of the fact that the desert is not so monotonous and foreign to alterity as one might think. It is nonetheless possible that it holds a kernel of truth. Erich Fromm, for example, without regarding the desert as the source of monotheism, accepts the possibility of the influence of one's life environment on one's general conception of the world. Evoking its significance as the symbol of the unfettered, unpropertied life, he considers the desert as the key symbol of the exit from Egypt. The desert is no home, it has no cities, it has no riches. Was it not then necessary that the Torah was given to man in the desert, in this landscape that frees the mind of all visible things and plunges it into the abyss of its own night? Pastoral life, solitude, and pure time facilitate the revelation that, as we know, is produced in the desert, write Josie Eisenberg and Armand de Becassis. God has chosen a people of nomads and not a sedentary people and forged it in the desert before giving it the promised land, so that it would not become affixed there, and remain faithful to its vocation. A similar idea was displayed in the 16th century by Maharal of Prague. Because the Torah is divine, because it is absolute intellect and not a collection of proprieties, it was given in the desert, because the desert presents an affinity with what is derived from God and intellect. Mircea Eliade observes, finally, the only preeminently pure and holy region is the desert, because there is where Israel remained loyal to its God. Renan writes again, there are monotheist races just as there are polytheist races, and this difference stems from an original diversity in the way they envision nature. A somewhat extreme opinion certainly, but one that has the advantage of emphasizing this much debated notion of nature. If being is the world, there would in fact necessarily be kinship, filiation, and consubstantiality of beings and ways of being, and the ways of being between them, consubstantiality consequently of man and nature like that of man and God. This bond of man to nature, let's say right off, should not be interpreted as flat naturalism, the return to nature dear to Rousseau's disciples, ecologists, and völkisch sects, but as an active participation of man in all that exists, based on his clear awareness of what exists. In this perspective, God can be in all things, not in the sense of a logos that contrives tangible reality from within, but as a dimension of this reality, its depth dimension. The mist on the mountain, the song of a bird, the flickering path of an insect can bear its mark. God can spread out toward man in the movement of the waves, the seeding grass, the blossoming flower. See the Christian paganism of Saint Francis of Assisi, who praises our sister the moon, our brother the wind, our mother the earth, our mother who bears and nurtures us, and especially my Ford our brother the sun. In the Indo-European religions, as I've said earlier, man is the measure of God. The society of gods is modeled on that of men, whose perpetuation and duration it secures by giving it an ideal representation. Man is the sole creator of the gods, because he is the sole giver of meaning. In Olympus or Valhalla, the gods exercise a functional social role in accordance with the model of the tripartite ideology, which has its equivalent in the city of men, either concretely or ideologically, in the Dummyzilian sense of the word. Far from being the opposite of this human world, the pantheon provides its most intense and solid justification. It constitutes its exaltation. The gods themselves display the characteristics of humans and testify to the same variety of aspirations. In the Iliad, when Zeus envisions rescuing Sarpedon from the sword of Patroclus, Hera tells him, "Do as you please, but do not expect the rest of the immortals to applaud." Likewise, when Brunhilde, disobeys Odin, an episode alluded to in the Edda, in the final verse of Fafnismal, her father imprisons her inside the circle of fire as punishment only reluctantly. She will eventually be freed by Siegfried. This is because Zeus and Odin are sovereigns, not despots. And religion here forms the natural cement of these collective structures which the religions of individual salvation, especially in their profane forms, will often have the effect of breaking. The gods, finally, are mortal. At the end of the cycle, they disappear. Among the Indo-Europeans, Jean Varena observes, there is a continuity between the most humble of creatures and the highest of the gods. This in no way implies that all these beings are commingled or equal, Quite the contrary, they form clearly separate and hierarchical groups. The norm is for each living being to fully assume his personal station or, as said in the Vedas, his dharma, both his status and his position, that is to say his place in the hierarchical scale of things. This continuity that connects the divine sphere and the sphere of men, as well as the sacred and the profane, unlike the dualism inherent to the world of the Bible, is one of the most characteristic features of paganism. In pre-Christian antiquity, there was no distinction between religion and civic life, not, in this instance, to subjugate it and deprive it of its own norms, but on the contrary, to sacralize it. Among the Romans, pietas is primarily a social virtue. Religion in Rome sacralized organic collectivities, from family to fatherland, hence the importance of the domestic cults, and on the other hand, the civic cult, which was later expanded to the imperial cult. It refers especially to respect for social norms and natural relations between individuals. It expands common discipline and extends the hierarchy. In this sense, it rests less on morality, or more exactly belief, than on participation in the rituals. To practice a cult is to be a good citizen and to affirm one's solidarity with the destiny of the city. Among the Germans, the cult is the foundation of the sacred, which is the foundation of law. Religion is inseparable from the Hide and Sitter, the pagan custom. This detail is illuminating, says Regis Boyer emphatically, because it provides sufficient grounds for concluding that the Germanic religion only existed in cultural practices and operations as a whole. It is in the practice of the rituals as participant or spectator that the German enters religion. The same could be said about the Iranians, the Vedic Indians, and the Celts. Judeo-Christian monotheism, in contrast to what has been often asserted, created less the conditions for respect of the individual than those of its deformation under the form of individualism, the ideology, which, once transposed to profane life, justifies in the name of an abstract universal truth the rupture of the individual's solidarity with the city. The relationship to the divine then becomes a purely individual matter. One makes one's own salvation. This feature, as we have seen, is given special emphasis in Christianity. Judaism compensates for it in large part by the ideal of the election of an entire people. In paganism, religion tends to primarily govern situations of collective interest. It gives a large role to the person, rather than the individual, but while taking into consideration those groups the person belongs to which are indispensable toward the grasp of his or her identity. It is not as an individual, notes Jean-Pierre Vernon, that the Greek man respects or fears a god, but as the head of the family, the member of a genos, a phratry, a demos, a city. This communitarian bond is so strong that in numerous ancient European societies, proscription is considered an exemplary punishment on its own. The idea according to which the outlaw, by being removed from the community, endures a kind of sacred curse, remained vital right into the Middle Ages. Subsequently, in paganism, the person is inseparable from his lineage. In ancient Scandinavian spirituality, the family constitutes one of the foundations of existence, with honor and destiny. A number of important decisions and actions are based solely on familial membership, and it was not considered prideful to wish to equal one's father, but, on the contrary, a dishonor if one showed less value than him. Immortality itself is connected to the world, as a memory that is left behind and transmitted like a living model. In this example, any shame or transgression of honor is a denial of the sacred. Physical and spiritual eternity combine. The majority of Indo-European peoples believed in some sort of beyond, in Sanskrit paradesha, in Iranian Piradaza, from which comes the word paradise, but this was still a transposition of this world. Far from representing the antithesis of real life, far from even suppressing the conflict that forms the contextual framework of the world, it carries them to a higher level. In Valhalla, there is still fighting. And the casualties arise anew, unharmed, at the evening of every day, by their mortal wounds. Before even the appearance of the theme of Valhalla, which some authors regard as a relatively late creation, Nordic devotion toward the souls of the dead was all the greater as those souls did not truly leave this world. The dead were believed to find shelter in some part of the earth or sky, and they inhabited a given site in the neighborhood of their former hearth, and so on. All commentators are in agreement with the view that belief in the Landveter, the souls of the dead, for example, was an essential feature of Icelandic paganism. These souls sometimes became elves, which Christianity transformed into demons. Among the Greeks, the Elysian fields were also only a sublime projection of this world. Among the Celts, the Cid, located beyond the seas, at the bottom of lakes, in the hills, or beneath the mounds, is a world parallel to our own that, while it is different or remote, is superimposed over this world or bathes it. In my opinion, this Celtic paradise has almost nothing in common with the Christian paradise, and is very conceptually close to the Germanic Valhalla and Islamic heavens. Its occupants lead a life of pleasure and delight. There they are loved by women of extraordinary beauty and high social rank. Sin, a Christian notion, and transgression, a pre-Christian notion, are unknown there. The Swede Stig Wikander has established, for his part, that the theme of the kingdom of heaven was of Indo-European origin. This brings to mind the words Nietzsche had Zarathustra shout, "I love those who do not seek beyond the stars for a reason to die or sacrifice themselves, who to the contrary, sacrifice themselves to the earth so that one day will come the reign of the Superman." This fundamental idea of a continuity between the human being and the world being can, however, only be fully grasped on condition, let me repeat, that it is not interpreted from the standpoint of naturalism. In my opinion, there has been far too much depiction of paganism as a nature religion that disregards all transcendence and is limited in some sense to only sacralizing natural determinisms. Some of its aspects, namely in folk and rural paganism, whose more or less deformed survivals have been numerous, have given that interpretation a foothold. Furthermore, this interpretation was systematized by Christian propaganda in order to have an easy means of opposing with the prerogative of the Spirit, which this new faith claims as its monopoly, the naturalistic clodishness of those who worship stones and imaginary things. This image is essentially false, and clinging to it is a grave error. In fact, nature is only one aspect of the world, it is not to be confused with it. Asserting the existence of a continuity between man and the world is not tantamount to reintegrating man into things, both animate and inanimate, and is even less a case of reducing him to his own nature, to the biological, the animal inside him, or stripping him of his specific character. Not only must continuity be viewed in a plural and even dialectical way, the laws of human consciousness cannot be boiled down to the biological any more than the biological can be boiled down to the microphysical, but it should be accepted that it works in two opposing directions, upstream and downstream, man going toward nature and man going toward divinity. This gives us reason to share Julius Evola's opinion, according to which what characterizes the pre-Christian world, at least in its higher forms, has nothing in common with the superstitious divinization of nature, rather it involves a symbolic comprehension of it through which all phenomena and all exterior actions appear as the tangible manifestation of a world beyond the tangible. We find here all the ambiguity of good nature. It is true that nature, as a representation of an aspect of the world, is fundamentally good. It is not so much that it determines us fully, so that, to a certain extent, we draw our meaning from it. On the contrary, it is far more a case of man who, by shaping it according to his will, determines nature and gives it meaning. There is in a certain school of neo-paganism, the very same that Evola criticized, a whole thematic of the Golden Age, of primitive pagan innocence, which appears to me extremely open to criticism, for the same reason as the doctrines that are often attached to it, neo-Rousseauism with its ultra-federalist resonance, völkisch ecologism, anti-state primitivism, and so on. This thematic implies a determinist and biologistic conception of man that does not correspond to reality, and paradoxically, intersects with the Judeo-Christian myth of Adamic innocence, which probably influenced it to some degree. The theology of paganism is not a theology of nature but a theology of the world. Nature displays the face of being, but does not constitute its ultimate determination. And just as the continuity between all the states of being, notably between men and gods, does not imply that these beings are commingled or spontaneously equal, the protest the European spirit has ceaselessly expressed against the divorce of heaven and earth, man and God, body and soul, does not imply that all these terms are placed on the same level. Body and soul are extensions of each other, they are both consubstantial to the world, yet it is the soul that rules. With regard to the body, it is what one could call an emergent quality. This is why paganism poses as a postulate the primacy of the idea, an idea that should not, however, be confused with the Platonic logias. This is also why I refuse all primarily naturalistic interpretations of the Indo-European religions, to seek out the core, not in a deification of the natural elements, nor even in a series of historic events transfigured by myth, but purely and simply in an ideological system, a particular view of the world, which from the onset gives meaning to all its components. From this perspective, we could say that man creates the world through the way he looks at it, that the soul forms itself a body, that a collective view of the world forms a society by informing it, and so on. We find ourselves in a place that is the exact opposite of naturalism. Creator of nature, man is also the creator of the gods. He shares in God every time he surpasses himself, every time he attains the boundaries of his best and strongest aspects. This idea will be repeated by Nietzsche, under a particular angle, with the theme, so often poorly understood, of the Superman. It finds in modern philosophical anthropology, Gecklin, Portman, Plusner, its epistemological justifications with the theme of man the builder, constructor of himself. It will finally be developed by Heidegger, and Levinas is right to see in this piety devoted to mythic gods what is the most alien to him, an offensive return, of the standards of human elevation. Paganism takes natural determinisms into consideration, but it does not make man subject to them. It always opposes human freedom and heroic will to the inevitable. In pre-Christian antiquity, whether in Germanic sagas, the Roman representation of fatum, or Greek tragedy, we constantly come across the idea that the impossible must be attempted, even and especially when it is truly impossible. The notion of destiny is different from that of predestination. It is an embodiment in every man of the sacred, which, as such, is associated with a process of becoming. Man does not suffer his fate, he can freely fulfill it, take charge of it or attempt to oppose it if he has a different idea of what it should be. Among the Germans, Regis Boyer reveals, destiny undergoes a kind of assimilation, the translation of which is the spirit of struggle, Vigiger. Man creates an idea of himself that is the translation of his destiny, he will seek to manifest it through his actions his entire life, his objective will have been attained if this idea is acknowledged by his contemporaries in common accord. Society is the enclosed field where a man's reputation is made, where the shape of his destiny proves itself. Destiny for the ancient Scandinavians was not a harmful, hostile power. It is rather the entire set of authentic states that experience allows one to undergo. When we read the texts of the sagas, notes Peter Hallberg, it is not primarily an immutable and dark destiny that draws the reader's attention, but rather the heroic attitude of the characters toward this destiny, not as defeat but victory. It is the importance of the notion of destiny that determines that of the notion of honor and not the other way around. It is because of the fact that one has a destiny that it is dishonorable to not face it. In a world where, after one has sounded one's capabilities, one decides to go all the way to the end, honor is to not betray the idea that one has of oneself. In this sense, dishonor is also mediocrity. In a more general fashion, explains Jean Varena, it seems that the Indo-Europeans profess that destiny is in fact the expression of the necessary progression of our actions, law of causality. For this reason, my free will, or that of a God intervening in the course of events, appears as a materialization of my destiny. I can be a hero if that is what I wish, and if I become one, if my will is strong enough, if the gods are not against me, one will be able to rightfully say this was my destiny. The notion of fatum does not entail obedience, submission, or renunciation. To the contrary, it stimulates the desire to take action and upholds the tragic sentiment of life. As stressed by Schopenhauer, the tragic is connected to the clear awareness man has of his weakness, the ephemeral nature of his life, and at the same time, his ceaselessly reasserted desire to compensate for this weakness with a creative intensity. In other words, the tragic implies a will to measure oneself against time, without ever finding the slightest pretext for renouncing it in the certainty of its final outcome, death. It upholds this pessimism of strength that Heidegger opposed to the pessimism of weakness and which demands awareness of the conditions and powers which, in spite of everything, secure the mastery of our historical situation. Heroism thus consists of struggling against what will eventually triumph, but a natural triumph, to which it is always possible to oppose another specifically human triumph. It is because there is a destiny that man, by attempting to fulfill or oppose it, can be heroic, surpassing himself and partaking of divine status. Amor fati, the sole means of submitting without submitting, exaltation carried to the deepest depths of an agonistic temperament which makes struggle, starting with the struggle against oneself, the very essence of life. Among the Stoics we also find the idea that free will, the condition of individual worth, is not excluded by predestination. This view was one that Chrysippus developed at length. Cicero in De Fato, Alexander of Aphrodisias in his treatise on fate, distinguished antecedent causes, about which we can do nothing, from imminent causes that depend solely on us. Destiny governs the world, said Seneca, but man's inner freedom is never afflicted by adversity. Man can always freely determine the meaning of his actions. Later, within the very heart of Christianity, a current of heretical thought would fight against the determinism of hereditary sin, while theologians confronted each other on predestination and grace to arrive at the conclusion that man is still free to act within what has been given him in advance. Helderlin, a fervent admirer of ancient Greece, declared that it is by realizing oneself in what is most removed from one's nature, that is to say, in what mandates the greatest self-constraint, that a people can give the best of themselves. This conception of freedom is closely tied to a certain conception of history. Nature, the innate, and the past may condition man's future but they do not determine it. It is within this semantic space between conditioning and determining that our freedom lies. Man can only work with what he boss, but it is with what he has that he is able to be and do as he likes.